Martha was a woman who never cared much for luxury. Even though her husband, Daniel, was one of the richest men in the country, she preferred a simple life. She didn't wear expensive jewelry, didn't show off designer clothes, and never bragged about her wealth. She found happiness in small things, cooking her own meals, gardening, helping others, and enjoying quiet mornings with a cup of tea. People who met her for the first time never guessed that she was married to a billionaire. To them, she looked like any ordinary woman who lived a normal, peaceful life. Daniel, on the other hand, was a very successful businessman. He owned one of the country's largest airlines, known for its luxury and first-class service. But despite his busy schedule and fame, he loved Martha deeply. He often told people that she kept him grounded, that she reminded him what really mattered in life, unlike others who surrounded him for money or power. Martha cared only about love, kindness, and honesty. One morning, Daniel had to travel for business to another city. Martha decided she would surprise him by flying on one of his company's planes. It had been a long time since she'd taken a flight alone. She wanted to see how the staff treated regular passengers when the owner wasn't around. She thought it would be interesting and maybe even fun to experience what ordinary travelers went through every day. That morning, Martha dressed in her favorite outfit, a simple beige sweater, comfortable jeans, and a pair of worn-out shoes. Her brown leather handbag was old but strong. She had carried it for years. Her hair was tied neatly in a bun, and she wore no makeup, just a warm smile on her face. She looked graceful, but in a very modest way. When she arrived at the airport, she didn't ask for any special treatment. She stood in line, just like everyone else, holding her ticket quietly. The ticket she carried was for a first-class seat. Daniel had insisted that she always travel comfortably, even when she traveled alone. But Martha didn't care about the seat. She cared about the experience. She wanted to see how people treated someone who looked ordinary but held an extraordinary secret as she walked through the airport. She noticed people glancing at her. Some looked past her as if she didn't exist. Others gave her quick looks, then turned away. She didn't mind. Martha had learned long ago that people often judge others by their clothes, their shoes, or their style. She believed that true worth couldn't be seen on the outside at the check-in counter. The airline employee smiled politely and checked her ticket. Everything was fine. But when Martha entered the first-class lounge, a few passengers turned their heads. They looked confused, even annoyed. One woman whispered to her husband, "She must have come to the wrong section." Another man stared, frowning slightly. Martha noticed, but she stayed calm and kept to herself. When the time came to board, Martha walked confidently toward the plane. The flight attendants greeted passengers with bright smiles, but their expressions changed slightly when they saw her first-class ticket. One of them looked puzzled, but forced a polite smile. Martha thanked her gently and found her seat near the window. She sat down quietly, arranging her small handbag on her lap as more passengers entered. Martha could feel their eyes on her. The men wore sharp suits, the women elegant dresses, diamonds sparkling on their fingers. She, in her plain sweater, looked completely out of place among them. But she didn't care. She looked out the window and smiled softly, remembering the first time she and Daniel flew together years ago. When they were newly married and had no money, back then, they had taken cheap flights, eaten instant noodles, and laughed about their dreams. Now, he owned an entire airline. Yet she still felt happiest in her simple ways, while the other passengers ordered champagne and adjusted their fancy luggage. Martha took out a small book from her bag. It was a collection of short stories she loved reading during flights. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just wanted a peaceful journey. But deep down, she knew not everyone would understand that. She looked at her boarding pass again and smiled. She felt proud not because of the luxury around her, but because of what her life represented. She had seen both sides of the world of wealth and the world of simplicity. And she knew that kindness mattered more than money ever could. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Martha leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of Daniel, probably in his office, busy with meetings and calls. She missed him, but she also admired how hard he worked. She knew he built his empire from nothing, and she stood by him through every struggle. She didn't know that today's flight would change everything. What seemed like a simple trip would soon turn into a lesson not only for her, but for everyone on that plane. The people who judged her would soon realize how wrong they were. But for now, Martha was calm and peaceful, enjoying the quiet hum of the airplane engines as the plane prepared to take off. She had no idea what awaited her in the next few hours. All she wanted was to travel quietly, read her book, and maybe sip a cup of tea while watching the clouds outside. Sometimes life tests the kindest hearts in unexpected ways. And Martha's gentle heart was about to be tested in a way she never imagined. Martha's plane had just taken off. And for a few peaceful minutes, she watched the clouds drift by outside the window. The soft hum of the engines calmed her. But soon, she began to feel uneasy. Something in the air had changed, not turbulence, but tension. It was the kind that came from people's stares, quiet whispers, and judgmental smiles. The first-class cabin was filled with luxury soft leather seats, silver-plated trays, and a faint scent of expensive perfume. The passengers around Martha looked like they belonged to another world. Men in sharp suits, women with sparkling jewelry and designer handbags. And then there was Martha, sitting quietly in her plain sweater, old shoes, and worn handbag resting by her feet. She had chosen to travel simply, but to the others, she looked out of place. A young woman sitting across from her whispered something to her friend, and both giggled softly while glancing in Martha's direction. A businessman beside her shifted uncomfortably, moving his bag slightly away, as if she didn't deserve to sit next to him. Martha noticed everything but said nothing. She just smiled faintly and continued reading her book. Soon, one of the flight attendants, a tall woman with a perfect bun and red lipstick, started serving drinks. She was polite and charming to everyone else, but when she reached Martha's seat, her expression changed. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of doubt. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said in a slightly cold tone. "Are you sure you're sitting in the right section?" Martha looked up from her book, a little surprised. "Yes," she replied softly. "Seat 1A, first class." She handed over her boarding pass with a calm smile. The flight attendant scanned it, her eyebrows knitting together. The ticket was valid. But even then, she hesitated. That's odd," she murmured, glancing toward another crew member. "Please give me a moment, ma'am. I just need to verify something." Martha nodded politely. "Of course," she said. She didn't take offense. She had been treated like this before by waiters, salespeople, even strangers who thought they could tell her worth by her clothes. Across the aisle, a well-dressed woman leaned toward the man next to her. She probably sneaked in, she whispered loudly enough for Martha to hear. "They should really check these things better. It ruins the experience for everyone." The man nodded, chuckling. Maybe she won a free upgrade or something. Martha turned her gaze back to the window. The laughter hurt a little, but she reminded herself that their ignorance said more about them than it did about her. She remembered Daniel's words. "Never explain your worth to those who judge you by sight. Let your dignity speak louder than your words." After a few minutes, the flight attendant returned, still uncertain. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but there seems to be a mix-up. This seat might not belong to you. Could you please move to economy class until we sort this out?" Martha blinked slowly, confused but composed. "I believe there's no mistake," she said gently. "Here's my confirmation email." She handed over her phone, showing the booking details, her name, the flight number, and the seat clearly listed as First Class 1A. The attendant frowned, looking uncomfortable. She whispered to another crew member who shrugged helplessly. Meanwhile, the whispers among the passengers grew louder. Some looked amused, others annoyed. It was as if everyone had decided that Martha didn't belong, no matter what proof she showed. "Ma'am, please cooperate," the attendant said firmly now. "We'll check everything after takeoff, but for safety reasons, I'll have to ask you to move to economy for now." Martha felt a sting in her heart. Her face flushed slightly, not from anger, but from embarrassment. Dozens of eyes were on her. Some passengers looked smug, as if justice had been served. Others simply looked away, pretending not to notice. Without arguing, Martha gathered her things. "Of course," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but inside she felt small. She stood up and began walking toward the back of the plane. The long aisle felt endless, every step echoing in her ears as whispers followed her daunt. In economy class, she found an empty seat by the window and sat down. The seat was smaller, the noise louder, and the stairs softer, but at least no one there cared how she looked. A kind elderly man sitting beside her smiled gently. "Rough day, dear?" he asked kindly. Martha returned a small smile. "Something like that," she said, "but I'll be fine." As the plane continued its journey, she opened her book again, trying to lose herself in the pages. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the way people had looked at her, as if her clothes decided her worth. What Martha didn't know was that the flight attendants were about to get the biggest shock of their lives. The ordinary woman they had just sent to economy wasn't just any passenger. She was the wife of Daniel Bennett, the billionaire owner of the very airline they worked for. And soon, the truth would come out in a way no one expected. The flight had been smooth for nearly an hour. But Martha couldn't shake off the sting of humiliation that clung to her heart. She stared quietly out of the small economy window, her reflection faintly visible against the clouds. Around her, children laughed, people chatted, and the sound of clinking drink cans filled the cabin. It was loud, but in her silence, everything felt distant. She wasn't angry, just disappointed. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, the same flight attendant, Clara couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Something about that woman's calmness bothered her. Most people, when asked to move, would have protested, maybe even caused a scene. But this woman? She'd smiled and obeyed, as if kindness mattered more than her pride. Clara had seen all kinds of passengers in her career: arrogant millionaires, spoiled celebrities, rude businessmen, but that woman's quiet dignity had unsettled her. Still, the whispers among the passengers had satisfied her earlier doubts. "It's better this way," one lady had said. "These people should know their place." Those words echoed in Clara's mind, but she had convinced herself she was doing her job. She didn't want to look foolish in front of the elite in economy. A young boy sitting across from Martha accidentally spilled juice on her sleeve. His mother panicked, apologizing over and over again. Martha smiled kindly and handed her a napkin. "It's all right," she said warmly. "Don't worry about it." The woman sighed in relief, clearly touched by Martha's gentle tone. Moments later, flight attendant came by with the meal cart. Martha thanked her politely and asked for a cup of tea. The attendant smiled, noticing her calm. Graceful manners, the kind rarely seen among impatient travelers. Back in the first-class section, something unexpected happened. A supervisor boarded the plane mid-flight, a routine inspection officer from the airline's corporate office. Clara stiffened when she saw him. His name was Mr. Jameson, and he was known for surprise quality checks. "Everything running smoothly?" he asked with a professional smile. "Yes, sir," Clara replied quickly. Straightening her uniform, Jameson nodded, glancing around the cabin. "Excellent. I'll just have a word with the passengers in economy, too." The CEO requested feedback from regular customers today. Clara froze. CEO. Feedback. The memory of the woman she had sent to economy flashed before her, eyes like lightning. Jameson walked past her before she could speak. A few minutes later, he reached economy and spotted Martha sipping her tea quietly. Her ticket information flashed on his tablet: first class, seat 1A. His brow furrowed immediately. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said kindly. "Are you Mrs. Martha Bennett?" Martha looked up with her gentle smile. "Yes, that's me, Mrs. Bennett." His tone shifted instantly, now filled with alarm and respect. "As in Mrs. Bennett, wife of Mr. Daniel Bennett, the owner of Skyrise Airlines." Martha blinked, a bit embarrassed. "Yes, but please, you don't need to make a fuss. Everything's fine." Jameson's eyes widened. "Fine, ma'am. You were downgraded from your seat." "I must apologize immediately." Without waiting, he turned and hurried toward first class. Clara noticed his face and felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. When he reached her, his voice was firm but controlled. "Clara, the woman you moved to economy, that was Mrs. Bennett, the CEO's wife." The color drained from Clara's face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "Mrs. Bennett," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Yes," Jameson said sharply. "You've just removed the owner's wife from her own airline's first-class seat." Gasps erupted from nearby passengers who overheard. The elegant woman who had mocked Martha earlier turned pale, her jewelry suddenly feeling heavy against her skin. The businessman who had laughed now stared down at his shoes, guilt written all over his face. "Bring her back," Jameson ordered. Immediately. Clara rushed down the aisle toward economy, her step shaky, her face flushed with shame. When she reached Martha, she bent slightly and spoke in a trembling voice. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding. Please allow me to escort you back to your seat." Martha looked up, calm as ever. "There's no need to apologize, dear," she said softly. "I'm fine here." "Ma'am, please," Clara insisted, her voice breaking. "If the captain finds out, I could lose my job." Martha hesitated, then stood up slowly. The passengers around her looked confused, not understanding what was happening. She followed Clara back to the front, her calm presence making the long walk feel strangely powerful. The same passengers who had mocked her earlier now lowered their heads, unable to meet her eyes. When she re-entered first class, silence fell over the cabin. Everyone stared as she took her seat again, the seat that had always been rightfully hers. Clara stood beside her, trembling, barely able to speak. "Mrs. Bennett, I deeply apologize. I made a terrible mistake." Martha smiled faintly and said, "It's all right. I'm not angry. But I do hope you remember this. Never judge someone by what they wear. You never know who they might be." Her words hung in the air, soft yet sharp, sinking deep into every heart around her. The shame was heavy, but the lesson was unforgettable at that very moment. A call came through the captain's radio. It was Daniel Bennett himself, checking on the flight's progress. When Jameson informed him of what had happened, Daniel's calm voice came through the speakers. "Please tell my wife I'll be waiting at the airport. And thank you for reminding my team. Respect should never depend on appearance." The message echoed like a closing line to a powerful story. And for everyone on that flight, it became a moment they would never forget. The cabin was quiet now, uncomfortably quiet. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Everyone in first class was pretending to relax, but their stolen glances said otherwise. Shame hung in the air like perfume that wouldn't fade. Martha sat back in her rightful seat, calm and composed, though her heart was still soft from the sting of what had happened. The same people who had laughed at her earlier now couldn't look her in the eye. The woman in the diamond necklace who had whispered cruel words before now clutched her glass of champagne nervously. The businessman who had shifted away from her earlier sat frozen, pretending to read a newspaper that his eyes weren't moving across. The flight attendant, Clara, stood beside the galley with trembling hands, replaying her mistake again and again in her mind. Martha looked out the window, her reflection soft against the sunlight. Her face was calm, but her thoughts were storming. She wasn't angry, not even close. But she couldn't forget the humiliation of walking down that long aisle earlier. Hearing people whisper, "She doesn't belong here." Those words still echoed faintly in her mind, like a bruise that didn't show on the surface but still hurt when touched. After a few minutes, Clara approached with a tray. Her eyes were red, not from anger, but regret. "Mrs. Bennet," she said softly, her voice shaking, "we've prepared something special for you. Please accept this meal on behalf of the crew." Martha looked up, smiled gently, and said, "Thank you, dear, but please don't treat me differently now. Just do your job as you always do, with respect for everyone." Clara swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered, her eyes glistening. Across the aisle, little girl who had been watching everything tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why did everyone get so scared of that nice lady?" she asked innocently. Her mother blushed, unable to answer. "Because, sweetheart," she finally whispered, "they judged her before knowing who she was." Martha heard it, and her heart softened. She smiled at the little girl, who waved shyly. "Never forget that," dear Martha said kindly. "Always look at hearts, not handbags." The girl nodded, and her mother lowered her head, embarrassed but grateful for the gentle reminder. The plane continued soaring through the clouds. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Where there had been arrogance, now there was humility. Where there had been laughter, now there was reflection. Martha's quiet grace had done what anger never could. It had made everyone look inward. When the captain announced they were halfway to their destination, Clara nervously walked to Martha again. "Mrs. Bennet," she said, "Mr. Bennet has just called the control tower. He knows what happened. He wanted to make sure you were comfortable." Martha smiled faintly. "That's very kind of him," she said. "Please tell him I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Not entirely. There was still a small ache in her chest, not because she cared about being disrespected, but because she had seen how quick people were to measure someone's worth by appearance. It wasn't new to her. She had grown used to it over the years. The disbelief when she said she took the bus, the surprise when people learned her husband's name, the stares when she wore plain dresses to fancy events. But today, it had hit deeper. She thought about all the people who face such treatment daily, not because they were rich in secret, but simply because the world failed to see their value. Her heart ached for them. At that moment, the businessman beside her cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Bennet," he began hesitantly, I owe you an apology. I was unkind earlier. I shouldn't have assumed." Martha turned her head slightly, her gentle smile never fading. "Thank you," she said. "Apologies matter when they're sincere. I accept it." He nodded, visibly relieved. The diamond lady followed soon after, her face red with shame. "I'm deeply sorry, too," she said. "It was wrong of me to judge you." Martha placed her hand lightly on the woman's. "Let's all learn from it," she said softly. "That's what life is for. Learning, growing, and being better." The simple warmth in her voice made the woman tear up. "You're a better person than I could ever be," she whispered. Martha chuckled gently.
"Oh no.
"I've just had more chances to forgive." For the rest of the flight, the energy shifted completely. The crew served with extra care, but not out of fear, out of respect. The passengers spoke more kindly, smiled more genuinely. Martha had turned their embarrassment to a quiet awakening. When the pilot's voice finally came through the speakers, "We'll be landing shortly." Ladies and gentlemen, the cabin felt lighter. People weren't just reaching for their bags. They were carrying something else, a lesson they hadn't expected to learn at 30,000 feet in the sky, as the plane began its descent. Clara approached Martha one last time. "Ma'am," she said, her voice steadier now, "I'll never forget today. You taught me more in a few hours than years of training ever did." Martha smiled, her eyes kind. "Then this flight wasn't wasted," she said. "Just remember, uniforms fade, titles change, but respect should always remain." The engines roared softly as the plane touched down. Outside, the runway gleamed in the sunlight, a new beginning for everyone aboard. And as Martha gathered her things, the passengers didn't see her as a simple woman anymore. They saw her as something far rarer, a woman of quiet strength, whose dignity needed no diamonds to shine. The wheels touched the runway with a soft thud, and the cabin filled with the usual shuffle of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts and reaching for their bags. But this landing felt different. The silence in first class wasn't the relaxed quiet of luxury, it was the heavy quiet of realization. Every person on that plane had been part of something they would never forget. Martha sat still for a moment, gazing out the window as sunlight spilled across the wings. The clouds drifted slowly behind them, but her mind was far away. She was thinking of Daniel, her husband. The man whose airline carried millions of people around the world. The man who built his empire from nothing. He was supposed to be waiting for her at the terminal, but she had no idea what was about to unfold when they met. As the plane rolled to a stop, the captain's calm voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated as we prepare to disembark." Martha smiled faintly, unhurried. But before anyone could stand, a quiet buzz moved through the cabin. The flight attendants had just received a message on their private intercom, a message that made Clara's blood run cold. "Attention, crew," said the pilot, his voice firm. "Mr. Daniel Bennett is waiting at the arrival gate for an inspection. He wishes to meet the first-class team personally." The moment those words hit, Clara's knees nearly gave out. Her heart thumped wildly in her chest. The other attendants exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale. The passengers, too, began murmuring softly, "Mr. Bennett, the owner of the airline." Martha sighed quietly. She had hoped to keep this quiet. She hadn't told Daniel anything yet. She didn't want to cause trouble. But the truth was already on its way to the surface. And nothing could stop it now. Clara hurried to Martha's seat, her hands trembling. "Mrs. Bennett." "He's here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's waiting right outside." "Oh God, I don't know what to do." Martha looked up, her expression kind but firm. "You'll do what's right," she said softly. "Tell the truth." When the doors opened, passengers began stepping out. One by one, their heads low, trying not to make eye contact with her. The same people who had sneered now gave polite smiles, their faces red with embarrassment. Some whispered apologies again. Others simply couldn't find the words. Martha accepted it all with grace, her gentle presence both humbling and disarming as she stepped into the jet bridge. Flashes of camera phones lit up. The airport staff had already gathered, whispering excitedly, "That's Mrs. Bennett, the owner's wife." But she didn't care for attention. She only wanted to find Daniel and make sure no one lost their job because of her. Then, she saw him. Daniel Bennett stood tall near the terminal gates, dressed in a dark, tailored suit. Phone in one hand, his sharp eyes scanning the arriving passengers. He was known in the business world for his authority, his calm voice, and his unshakable sense of justice. But when he saw Martha walking toward him, wearing her simple clothes and gentle smile, his expression softened instantly. "Martha," he said warmly, stepping forward. "I missed you." She smiled, reaching up to touch his arm. "You're early." "I heard you had an interesting flight," he said quietly, his tone carrying a hidden edge. "My staff mentioned something about a misunderstanding." Before Martha could respond, Clara appeared behind her, nearly in tears. "Sir, please, it was my fault," she blurted out, her words rushing like water. "I thought she was in the wrong seat. I didn't know who she was. I swear I didn't mean any disrespect." Daniel looked at her, his eyes calm but piercing. "You didn't know who she was," he repeated slowly, "but you knew enough to judge her." Clara's voice cracked. I was just following what I thought was protocol, sir. Protocol doesn't teach disrespect." Daniel interrupted gently, but firmly. "Protocol teaches professionalism. Respect should be given to every person, not only to the ones who look rich." The crowd around them had gone completely still. Passengers from first class, now standing nearby, looked down, ashamed. Martha placed a hand on Daniel's arm. "Please," she said softly. "Don't be too harsh. She made a mistake, yes, but she's learned from it. I can see it." Daniel looked at her, the woman who had every reason to be angry, but chose forgiveness instead. Slowly, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "No one will lose their job. But this will be a lesson not just for the crew, but for everyone in this company. From this day on, we will judge people by their actions, not appearances." Clara wiped her tears, nodding gratefully. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered. Daniel turned back to Martha, smiling with admiration. "You always manage to turn anger into wisdom," he said. Martha chuckled softly. "Maybe because I've had enough chances to practice forgiveness." They walked together through the terminal as staff and passengers watched silently. The woman they had dismissed as too plain for first class now walked beside the man who owned the entire airline. Yet her head wasn't held high in arrogance. It was held high in quiet grace. Before they reached the exit, a journalist nearby whispered, "Mrs. Bennett, how does it feel to have been mistaken for an ordinary woman?" Martha stopped, turned slightly, and smiled. "It feels wonderful," she said. "Because being ordinary isn't an insult. It's a reminder that wealth doesn't make us better people. Kindness does." The cameras flashed again, capturing her words forever. And as she walked away with Daniel, hand in hand, those who had mocked her earlier stood still, realizing that true class could never be worn. It could only be lived. The next morning, news of what had happened on Flight 209 spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a small story among airline staff, it was everywhere. Passengers had shared the tale online, adding dramatic captions like "She looked poor, but she owned the plane," and "Never judge a book by its cover." This one owned the airline. Within hours, the video clips had gone viral, and the world couldn't stop talking about the humble billionaire's wife at the Skyrise Airlines headquarters. Daniel sat in his glass-walled office reading through a flood of emails. Some were from reporters demanding interviews, others from business partners expressing shock, but most were from ordinary people who felt touched by the story. "Your wife reminded us what real class looks like," one message said. Another wrote, "The world needs more people like Martha Bennett." Daniel leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. He wasn't proud because the story made headlines. He was proud because his wife had once again shown grace where others would have shown anger. He called an emergency meeting with his senior management and crew training department. The room was tense, filled with silence and guilt. Clara, the flight attendant, sat near the end of the table, her head low. She hadn't slept all night, replaying every second of her mistake, the tone in her voice, a look in Martha's eyes, the shame that came after. Daniel began softly. What happened yesterday wasn't just an incident. It was a mirror showing us who we've become. He looked around the table. Our airline was built on a promise to treat every passenger with dignity. But somewhere along the way, that promise got lost beneath expensive suits and gold cards. The room remained silent. Some nodded slowly. Others stared down at their notes. Double quotes, "Mrs. Bennet didn't tell me to punish anyone." Daniel continued. "She asked for understanding. But I believe understanding must lead to change. From today, every staff member from pilots to ground crew will go through empathy and equality training. No one, I repeat, no one will be treated differently because of how they look." Clara raised her hand timidly. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling, "I just want to say, I'm truly sorry. I didn't mean to be cruel. I thought I was protecting the company's image." Daniel looked at her kindly. "You don't protect the company's image by protecting pride," he said. "You protect it by protecting people." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Mrs. Bennet was so kind. She forgave me when she had every reason not to. I'll never forget that. Daniel nodded. "Good," he said. "Let that memory guide how you treat every passenger from now on." Meanwhile, Martha sat quietly at home, unaware of the viral storm outside. She had made herself tea and was tending to her small garden in the backyard. The morning sun glowed softly on her face as she watered her roses. Her phone buzzed. Non-stop journalists, influencers, and strangers all wanted to talk to her. But she ignored it all. Fame didn't matter to her. Peace did. Later that day, Daniel returned home. He found Martha kneeling in her garden, humming softly as she clipped a few flowers. "The whole world's talking about you," he said with a smile. She looked up, amused. "Oh dear," she chuckled. "What did I do this time?" "You reminded them what kindness looks like," he said. "Even my employees are reflecting on their behavior. It's changing people." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and stood up. "If a little embarrassment can teach a big lesson, then it was worth it," she said gently. "But promise me one thing. Daniel, don't make it about punishment. Make it about awareness." Daniel nodded. "I already did. The training starts next week. Every employee, even me." She smiled warmly. "Good, because respect isn't a rule. It's a habit." The following week, Skyrise Airlines made a public statement. The press conference was broadcast on national TV. Daniel spoke with confidence while Martha stood beside him, dressed as she always did, simple, elegant, and kind. "My wife's experience reminded us all of something vital," Daniel said into the microphones. "That humility is not weakness. That kindness is not low class. And that respect should never depend on appearances." Cameras flashed. The audience applauded. Martha said only one thing before they left the stage, a single line that would soon be quoted across social media. "The way you treat someone who can do nothing for you shows who you really are." That quote appeared on posters, news headlines, and even training materials in airports around the world. Skyrise Airlines became known not just for luxury, but for empathy. The company's slogan changed to reflect that spirit. Every passenger matters. As weeks passed, the story slowly faded from the headlines, but its message remained alive in countless hearts. Clara continued working as a flight attendant, now known for her kindness and patience. She never looked at a passenger the same way again, and Martha, she remained the same humble woman she had always been. She still took walks in her garden, still smiled at strangers, and still believed that one small act of understanding could change the world. Daniel often said, "I built the airline," but Martha gave it its soul. And in truth, he was right. Because one woman's quiet dignity had done what no company policy ever could. It had made humanity fashionable again. The sun was setting in a warm golden haze when Martha sat by her window, watching the sky turn shades of amber and rose. The world outside looked peaceful, as if it had forgiven itself for all its noise and mistakes. She took a deep breath, letting the soft light rest on her face, unaware that her story had quietly changed the lives of thousands across the globe. Weeks had passed since that unforgettable flight, but people were still talking about the simple woman who had been expelled from first class. The video clips continued to circle the internet. Bloggers called her the woman who redefined class. Schools used her story as a lesson on empathy. Even airline companies around the world began adopting Skyrise's new training model, inspired by her grace. But to Martha, life hadn't changed. She still woke up early, still made her tea the same way, still smiled at strangers at the market. Fame had never interested her. Her heart was too quiet for that. She only hoped that, somewhere, someone was learning not to judge another person by what they wore or how they looked. One morning, she received a letter. It was from Clara, the flight attendant. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Dear Mrs. Bennett, I don't know if you'll remember me, but I will never forget you. Because of you, I changed. Not just how I treat passengers, but how I see people, including myself. Thank you for teaching me that kindness isn't weakness, and forgiveness isn't foolishness. You taught me more in one flight than life had in years. With respect, Clara." Martha smiled softly, her eyes misting. She folded the letter neatly and placed it in her journal. For her, that letter was worth more than gold. It meant the world had learned something, even if just one heart at a time. That evening, Daniel joined her on the porch. He looked at her lovingly, a cup of coffee in his hand. "Do you ever regret that day?" he asked gently. She chuckled lightly. "Not at all," she said. "If it hadn't happened, people would still think kindness belongs only to the rich, or that humility means weakness. Sometimes life needs a little shake to remember what matters." Daniel nodded, smiling. "You've changed how people see our airline. But more than that, you've changed how people see each other." Martha leaned back, her eyes following a plane flying high above them. "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't do anything special. I just didn't let other people's cruelty make me cruel." Her words hung in the air, simple, but powerful. The media continued to call her the billionaire's wife who taught the world a lesson. But to Martha, she was still just the same woman, the one who wore plain sweaters, watered her garden, and believed that goodness didn't need an audience. Months later, during a company event, Skyrise Airlines unveiled a new campaign in her honor. A large screen lit up behind Daniel as he spoke to an audience of employees, passengers, and journalists. The words on the screen read, "Respect has no class. Kindness flies first." Daniel turned to the crowd and said, "This slogan came from one woman's example. My wife didn't fight back with anger or pride. She chose grace, and that's the kind of strength this world needs." The room erupted into applause, but Martha, sitting quietly in the front row, simply smiled. She didn't see herself as a hero, only as a reminder of something the world too often forgets, that appearances fade. But character never does. As they left the event that evening, a young girl approached her shyly, clutching a small piece of paper. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "my teacher showed us your story in school. I want to be kind like you when I grow up." Martha bent down, her eyes warm. "You already are," she said. "Never stop being gentle, even when the world isn't." The girl hugged her tightly, and in that moment, Martha realized the true legacy she had left behind, not in the form of headlines, wealth, or influence, but in the hearts of those who had learned to see differently from that day on. People began to share her quote, the one she had spoken at the airport, the one that summed up her life's belief. "The way you treat someone who can do nothing for you shows who you really are." Years later, even after the story faded from the front pages, that line remained engraved on plaques at airports, classrooms, and offices around the world. It became a silent promise, A reminder that kindness doesn't need recognition, and humility doesn't need wealth to shine. And as for Martha, she continued to live quietly, still traveling sometimes, not in first class, not in luxury, but as herself. People still recognized her occasionally, offering smiles or thanks. She always smiled back and said the same simple words: "Just remember, true class isn't in your seat, it's in your heart." And somewhere high above the clouds, another flight carried her story onward, not as gossip, not as legend, but as truth. Because sometimes one simple woman can teach the entire world how to be human again.